Okay, so on the spiritual path there are a number of traps of the mind, and as we're practicing we can come up against these traps. Most people will experience most of these traps at some point, and then the only question is, can we recognize them for what they are and move past them, or do we get stuck? And if we get stuck, how long do we get stuck for? Okay, so I want to go through a number of these traps just to, if we know what the traps are, then we can recognize them when they arise and hopefully just move past them quickly. So one of the biggest traps that I see people falling into is mistaking an intellectual understanding of enlightenment with enlightenment. Okay, so people read about enlightenment, they read about liberation, they read about non-duality, and they form an intellectual understanding of it. Okay, so they're able to intellectualize it, they're able to speak about it, but it's only on the intellectual level. They've only understood it intellectually. Liberation is something that has to be lived, has to be genuine, has to be directly experienced. And the direct experience of liberation is completely different from an intellectual understanding of liberation. The direct experience of non-duality is completely different from an intellectual understanding of non-duality. And if people become attached to their intellectual understanding, their intellectual knowledge, they can end up stuck there for years, thinking that they've understood what they need to understand. But the direct lived experience is something else, something completely different. And one way of knowing what the difference is between an intellectual understanding of liberation and the actual lived experience is that there's no longer any suffering. When it's a genuine lived experience, there'll be no longer any suffering. There'll be no longer any confusion. There'll be no doubt. And our life is simply lived in harmonious balance. If it's just an intellectual understanding, then there can still be suffering, there can still be confusion, there can still be doubt. Okay, so don't get caught up in intellectual understandings. Another trap of the mind is called nihilism. Okay, this is when people are practicing and they develop the idea that there's nothing to do, nowhere to go, nothing matters, or even that there's no one who could do anything. People enter a nihilistic state. This can even become so strong that they stop engaging in spiritual practices. They think there's no point in engaging in spiritual practices because there's nothing to be gained anyway, and there's no one who could do the practices even if they wanted to, because the self doesn't exist. So this is actually a myth. The idea that there is no self is a myth. It's a myth that arose from the Buddhist tradition, from people misunderstanding the teachings of the Buddha. Okay, so there is actually a self, and there are actions that we can take that lead to our liberation. So if you notice yourself falling into a state of nihilism, becoming inactive, despondent, then recognize that that is a trap of the mind and don't fall for it. Okay, another trap of the mind that is actually very common, and one that I've fallen into many times over the last 30 or 40 years, and this is wanting to recreate powerful spiritual experiences. Okay, so we might be meditating one day, suddenly it feels like everything is going our way, beautiful bliss states arise, everything's pure, clear, ecstatic. And then the next day we sit down to meditate and we want that experience again. And in fact, just the wanting it to come again will usually stop it from coming again. Yeah, that there's a certain energy in wanting something that we haven't got, and that usually prevents these experiences from coming again. But people can spend years trying to recreate that thing that happened to them on that retreat 5 years ago. And it can happen in a very subtle way that maybe not even consciously aware of it, but that in the back of their mind there is the idea, if I do this, then that will come again. I'll get that experience back again. So this is a common trap of the mind, and it's an important one to spot, because it's obvious, when we look at it in this way, practicing meditation, wanting something from the past is not going to work. Even if it does come again, then we'll be trying to hold on to it, and then it'll go again, and then we'll be, you can see logically that it doesn't make any sense. So recognize that that's a trap of the mind, notice it when it arises, let it go. Always be with what is. Yeah? Whatever is, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Don't create ideas about something else that we could have, we could get, we could become. Okay, another trap of the mind, and this is a trap that people sometimes fall into if they try progressing too fast, especially if they try progressing into self-inquiry practices too quickly. And that's the trap of dissociation. So this is where people start to become detached from things, but they become detached from them when they're not ready. They become detached from their body, this is not my body, detached from their emotions, detached from life in general, detached from their ideas, their thoughts. But they're doing this too soon. So detachment is actually an important stage on the path. There is a stage on the path where we do learn to separate pure awareness from the objects arising in awareness. But if we come to that too early, it can turn into dissociation, and people become unable to function, unable to operate in the world, and simply confused over what it is that they are and how they should relate to the world. So come to self-inquiry practices at the right time, when you're ready, when you're able to examine your relationship with the objects of consciousness, your relationship with your body, with thoughts, with feelings, with emotions, while still being able to function fully in the world. Okay, there needs to be enough presence, there needs to be enough clarity, there needs to be enough abiding in stillness for that ability to function in the world to continue, even whilst we're coming to see that we are not the body, we're not the mind, we're not the objects of the mind, we're not our emotions, and so on. So that's a trap of the mind, dissociation, usually arising from coming to advanced teachings too quickly. Okay, another trap of the mind is the inflation of the spiritual ego, I sometimes refer to as ego aggrandizement. And this is something that can happen as the mind latches onto things and takes possession of them. So we're practicing every day, practicing our meditation. We start entering very beautiful states of consciousness, or we start having powerful insights into things. And then the ego comes in, the mind comes in and says, oh, you're a really advanced meditator now, better than those other meditators, or you're having really advanced insights now, much better insights than those other meditators. So the spiritual ego can arise. And again, this is something that, when you take a step back, you can see how silly it is. But when people are engaged in it, it doesn't seem silly. It seems, seems quite believable. And one of the things that the Buddha did when he was alive, he actually banned his monks and nuns from speaking about spiritual experiences. And one of the reasons that he did this was because if people talk about spiritual experiences, they can develop jealousy. You hear someone else talk about their amazing experience, and then you might want that as well. And then the other side of that is it can develop this spiritual ego. People talk about their spiritual experiences and then they think they're better than the people that they're talking to. So the Buddha actually banned his monks and nuns from speaking about spiritual experiences. Personally, I don't think that's very healthy. I think it's healthy to be able to speak about spiritual experiences, but we need to be on our guard. Don't develop jealousy if someone else has had this incredible experience. Remember, it's just an experience. It comes, it goes. And also don't fall into the trap of ego aggrandizement, of developing a spiritual ego. There was one spiritual teacher who once said that the most important thing that comes out of any spiritual experience is what were you able to let go of? Yeah? Ask yourself the question, what was I able to let go of? And then that can help to not develop a spiritual ego. Okay, and another trap of the mind, neglecting ethical responsibilities. Okay, so this is something that can happen as people start to realize that there is no separate self. Then they might start to think, well, if there's no separate self, then what does anything matter? I can behave however I like. Everything is the self, everything is that, everything is the divine. So why not just do whatever I want? So suffering does exist, and we can harm people in the world. And so it is important to retain ethical responsibility, even as we're beginning to see that everything is divine, even as we're beginning to see that everything is one. Still, do not harm others, do not lie, do not cheat, do not steal, do not engage in sexual misconduct, and so on. So keep your ethical conduct in place, no matter how elevated your spiritual experiences become. Okay, and one more trap of the mind that I wanted to talk about, and that's the trap of thinking that we've arrived, thinking that we've reached the end of the journey. Okay, there actually is no end to the journey. As we practice, what happens is that there's a falling away. And this falling away becomes more and more profound. And it encompasses more and more of every aspect of our existence. There's a falling away of likes and dislikes. There's a falling away of processes of identification. There's a falling away of ideas. There's a falling away of pretty much everything. Okay, pretty much everything. And this includes anything that can come after the two words I am. Okay, if you can put anything after those two words, then that will also need to fall away. So if you can say I am becoming enlightened, that needs to fall away. If you can say I am enlightened, that needs to fall away. If you say I am not enlightened, that needs to fall away. There's never a moment on the spiritual path when we can say I have arrived. Yeah. All there is this continuous process of falling away. Okay, so if you ever find yourself thinking that you're enlightened or that you've reached the end of the journey, that's something else to let go of. That's another thing to let go of. Yeah. There isn't anything that can arise that we don't need to let go of.